Both images show a man in an ornate military uniform, riding a horse that is rearing to the left. Figure 8. 1. Heroic images. Inspired by Jacques-Louis David's famous portrait of A. Napoleon Bonaparte crossing the Alps in May 1800. B. Venezuelan artist José Hilarión Ibarra depicted the liberator Simón Bolívar on horseback in equestrian portrait of Simón Bolívar in about 1826. Credit left. Modification of work Napoleon Bonaparte crossing the Alps at the Grand Saint Bernard by Shadow de Malmaison / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit right. Modification of work equestrian portrait of Simón Bolívar by unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Chapter outline. 8.1 Revolution for whom? 8.2 Spanish North America. 8.3 Spanish South America. 8.4 Portuguese South America. In the late 18th century, new ideas of freedom spread throughout the Americas, raised by the Declaration of Independence in the former British American colonies in 1776 and by the French Revolution of 1789. These principles, combined with poor conditions for a majority of people in French, Spanish, and Portuguese America, and a growing distrust of monarchy, soon led to revolutions against colonial authorities. In the first 3 decades of the 19th century, most European American colonies gained their independence. While each revolution was unique, all were connected to the broader trend of using nationalism to oppose unequal power dynamics. During these rebellions, the majestic horse, a vital part of the history and mythology of power, consider Pegasus and centaurs, for example, was associated with liberators, who were admiringly depicted on their mounts to convey independence, courage, triumph, and heroism. Figure 8. 1. In 1521, the Viceroyalty of New Spain is founded. In 1531, the Virgin of Guadeloupe is said to appear. A portrait of the Virgin of Guadeloupe is shown. In 1776, the United States declares independence. From 1780 to 1781, Tupac Amaru II leads a rebellion against Spain, and an image of Amaru is shown. In 1789, the French Revolution begins. In 1807, the Portuguese monarch relocates to Brazil. An image of the arrival of the Portuguese monarchy is shown. In 1810, Grito do Ipiranga declares Mexican independence. In 1812, the Cadiz Constitution is adopted. In 1815, Simon Bolivar writes Letter from Jamaica, and an image of Bolivar is shown. In 1819, Gran Colombia is formed. In 1821, the Plan de Iguala cements Mexican independence. In 1822, the Ipiranga Cry declares Brazilian independence, and an image of soldiers cheering independence is shown. Figure 8. 2 Timeline. Revolutions in Latin America. Credit 1531. Modification of work Virgin of Guadeloupe by unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1780-1781. Modification of work Portrait of Tupac Amaru II by unknown / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1807. Modification of work Embarkation of the Portuguese Royal Family by Itamaraty Historical and Diplomatic Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1815. Modification of work Retrato Equestre de Bolivar by Galeria de Art National / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit 1822. Independence or Death by Museu Paulista Collection / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In the world map, most of South America and the bottom of North America are highlighted. Figure 8. 3 Locator map. Revolutions in Latin America. Credit. Modification of work World Map Blank Shorelines by Maciej Jaros / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to analyze the social hierarchy of Spanish America, discuss the Bourbon reforms imposed by the Spanish crown on its American colonies, explain how European political developments affected Haiti and the Spanish-American colonies. The 100 Years after 1750 marked a profound restructuring of world power and a host of political and economic changes in the Atlantic world. The French-American, Spanish-American, and Portuguese-American colonists encountered different historical circumstances than those met by their neighbors, the former British colonists who declared their independence in 1776. Nevertheless, they too launched successful bids for independence. The Revolutionary War, 1776–1783, the French Revolution, 1789–1799, and the Peninsular War, 1808–1814, were watershed events that reverberated across South America on inspiring waves of revolutionary upheavals. The diversity of the European-American colonial societies meant, however, that revolution promised different things to different people in this vast region. Social hierarchy and Bourbon reforms in Spanish America. By the end of the 18th century, Latin American societies had become rigidly stratified. Status was dependent on a number of social markers including education, family and professional ties, race, religion, and wealth. Color was the most obvious and most complicated non-economic factor that affected social position. Whiteness was more than a mark of economic superiority. It indicated European ancestry, which in turn denoted status as a Christian, and thus a degree of presumed social and moral superiority. Furthermore, European males born in the Iberian Peninsula, the peninsula on which Spain and Portugal are located, called peninsulars in Spanish America and Réunions in Portuguese America, considered themselves superior to males of European descent born in the Americas, who were called Creoles in Spanish America. In the first centuries of colonization, those born in Europe tended to monopolize the highest positions in church and state as well as the means of production, whereas most of the landed elite miners, plantation owners, were Creoles. In the decades leading to the movement toward independence, however, Europeans and their descendants in the Americas were struggling to maintain their position at the top of the social pyramid. They had to face the reality that they had imposed an unequal system in which a small group of Europeans and their descendants held power over a much larger group of American Indians and enslaved Africans, as well as a vast contingent of mixed-race people or castas consisting of mestizos, literally mixed in Spanish, and used mainly for people of white European and Indian descent, and pardos, brown in Spanish for someone of part African descent. This ethnically mixed population dominated urban areas, often working as shoemakers, tailors, and other types of artisans. Some mestizo and pardo men served in the lower ranks of the colonial militias. Beyond the book, 18th century casta paintings. The three 18th century images shown here are known as casta paintings and reflect the tremendous ethnic diversity of Spanish America. This diversity was the result of enslaved Africans and their descendants marrying American Indians and white European men, who faced a shortage of eligible European women, marrying both American Indians and Africans. The Spanish colonists attempted to understand and control this racially diverse society by creating social categories based on skin color, such as mestizos, pardos, and others. Casta paintings were made to depict these various categories, figure 8-4, and thus they offer us insight into historical views of the relationship between a person's skin color and socioeconomic position. As you look at these images, consider the ways in which they depict racial intermarriage, mixed-race families, and life in Spanish America, figure 8-5. Image A shows a white father with his Spanish Indian wife and their mixed-race daughter. The man wears shirt, vest, and a long coat, decorated with embroidery and oversized lace cuffs. The mother and child both wear jewelry and dresses decorated with floral embroidery. Image B consists of 16 small paintings. Each painting shows a different racial combination of a man, woman, and child. Figure 8. For the Casta class. A. Miguel Cabrera's Pintura de Castas, 1763, shows a white Spanish or Creole father and Spanish Indian mestiza mother with their mixed-race castaza daughter. B. Las Castas Mexicanas, 1777, by Ignacio Maria Bard, depicts the 16 different racial classifications found in Spanish colonies in the Americas. Credit A. Modification of work de Español y Mestiza, Castaza by unknown wiki art public domain. Credit B. Modification of work Casta painting by Museo Nacional del Virreinato / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. This is a three-part image. The Virgin of Guadalupe is at the top. Below the Virgin are several images of mixed-race groups. The bottom of the image shows fruits and vegetables. Figure 8. 5 Virgin and Castas. Luis de Mina's Virgin of Guadalupe and Castas, 1750, depicts an image of the Holy Virgin along with various mixed-race people, or castas, and other elements of Mexican daily life. Credit. Casta painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe by Museo de America / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. What do these images of Spanish, American, and Indian people reveal about the relationship between skin color and socioeconomic position in Spanish America? What do they indicate about the success of cultural assimilation to the Spanish way of life? Why do you think the Spanish colonists were so concerned with racial categorization? At the end of the 18th century, the Kingdom of Spain, which had been led by the House of Bourbon since 1700, reorganized its American colonies into 4 large parts. These were New Spain, in existence since 1521, Peru, in existence since 1542, New Granada, created in 1717 and roughly equivalent to the countries of Colombia, Ecuador, Panama, and Venezuela today, and Rio de la Plata, created in 1776 with territory corresponding to modern-day Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Figure 8. 6. As before, the ruler of each of these viceroyalty units represented the Spanish king. Now, however, local governments within each of the viceroyalties were in the hands of governors, or intendants. A map of the world is shown. Central America, including Caribbean islands and most of present-day United States, is shaded blue, representing viceroyalty of New Spain. Most of the western coast of South America is shaded orange, representing viceroyalty of Peru. The northern part of South America extending into Panama is shaded pink, representing viceroyalty of New Granada. The southern part of South America, except the western coast, is shaded green, representing viceroyalty of the Rio de la Plata. Figure 8. 6 Spanish possessions in the Americas. The map shows the 4 viceroyalties that made up Spain's possessions in the Americas in 1790. Attribution. Copyright Rice University, OpenStax, under CC by 4. 0 license. These governors were peninsulars who were appointed by and reported directly to the king, in an attempt to reduce corruption and enforce centralization. They were assisted by other peninsulars. Many recently arrived from Spain, and far below the Creole elite, they governed in terms of education, wealth, and culture. This centralization of administration under the intendancy system brought with it industrial and economic development and new material prosperity for peninsulars and Creole landowners and merchants. However, only those born in Spain, the peninsulars, could hold the most important offices in the government. Although Creoles could become wealthy under the system, wealth did not translate to social status. The sharp division between them and the peninsular Spaniards fueled Creoles' desire for self-government. It was during this Bourbon era that Enlightenment ideas spread across the Atlantic world, including to the Spanish colonies in North and South America. These ideas were rooted in the principle that all people were entitled to take part in their government, and they influenced Creoles in Latin America to demand the right to participate more fully in politics and the economy, which was largely controlled by Spain. The aims were revolutionary, but they stopped short of radically changing the social order. The colonial Creole elite originally petitioned only that authority be extended to white males of Spanish descent. Native populations and African and mixed-race populations were excluded. The white male Creole elites pointed to the hypocrisy of the egalitarian rhetoric of Europeans and questioned the universal ideals linked to the new rights of citizens, but they did so with only themselves in mind. An important contributing factor in the desire of Creoles and other groups for more participation in politics and the economy was the increased availability of books and other printed material. Traditionally, the Spanish-American white elite had been literate and educated, unlike the lower social groups of color, which largely relied on oral tradition for transmitting knowledge. By the end of the 18th century, however, the circulation of books and manuscripts had greatly increased among the huge mixed-race population, even if these groups did not share in the other benefits accorded to white people. Still, the dangerous notions of the Enlightenment were able to spread not only among educated Creoles in the colonies, but among mixed-race people as well. Those ideas, combined with resentment of the peninsulars, were fuel for late 18th century rebellions. Their desire for participation added to the Creoles' anger over the creation of the intendancy system. The Bourbon monarchy had also instituted other reforms to strengthen its American empire and its control over it. The colonial militia was expanded, and newly created army units were staffed by men born in Spanish America. This reduced the cost of defending the empire because Spanish troops no longer had to be transported across the ocean. However, like political offices, the highest military positions were reserved for peninsulars, another cause of Creole discontent. Along with changing the political and military life in its colonies, in 1767 Spain followed the example of Portugal and expelled the Jesuit missionaries from its American empire, angering people at both ends of the social ladder. Not only did the Jesuits have a reputation as the most humane managers of American Indian forced laborers, but they had also educated many of the Creole elite, and many young Creole men had joined the Jesuit order. Finally, the Bourbons imposed economic reforms, and these were often unpopular as well. The purpose of colonies was to enrich and strengthen the parent country, so the Spanish monarchs wished to make their American possessions as profitable as possible by, for example, more efficiently collecting taxes from the residents and improving free trade. Essentially, this meant Spanish manufacturers were free to sell their goods in the colonies, where they competed with local producers and merchants, and often drove them out of business. At the same time, colonial producers were still not free to sell their goods to either French or British buyers. A number of monopolies remained in force. For example, the Crown controlled all tobacco production and sale. Unlike the political reforms that affected primarily the Creoles, the economic changes affected people at all levels of Spanish-American society, who sometimes reacted violently to such insurrections, sparked by an increase in the colonial sales tax, were the massive 1780–1781 Inca rebellion near Cusco in the Viceroyalty of Peru, and the 1781 Comunero, Commoner, revolt in New Granada, Colombia. In both these viceroyalties, the basis of Spanish economic activity had evolved from the payment of tribute to the enforcement of systematic forms of labor such as debt servitude. The Great Inca Rebellion was led by José Gabriel Condorcanqui Noguera, a respected local mixed-race leader. Noguera opposed the forced labor the Spanish demanded from American Indians, and to move indigenous people to rebel, he claimed descent from the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, and called himself Tupac Amaru II, figure 8. 7. Threatened by his mobilization of some 40,000 people from among the Viceroyalty of Peru's Indian majority, outnumbered Creoles joined the Spanish and brutally crushed the revolt, which had threatened to become a rebellion against white, not simply Spanish, rule. Tupac Amaru II and tens of thousands of others were killed. Portrait of Tupac Amaru II. Amaru has long hair. He wears a long brown tunic over a black jacket and knee breeches. He also wears a large medallion around his neck. Mountains are in the background. Figure 8. 7. Tupac Amaru II. This portrait of Tupac Amaru II by an unknown artist depicts the indigenous leader who invoked the legacy of the Inca Empire to inspire people in Peru to rise up against the Spanish. Credit: Portrait of Tupac Amaru II by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In addition to resisting colonial taxes, the Comunero Rebellion of 1781 rose up against laws that granted the Spanish crown a monopoly over the production of tobacco and liquor. Calling for the restoration of traditional forms of governance, this revolt spread throughout the mountains, and armed protesters descended on Bogotá. First, the Spanish authorities there decided to negotiate. They agreed to repeal the taxes and end the monopolies, as well as give Creoles preference over peninsulars in government positions. However, once the Comuneros dispersed, and the viceroy learned of Bogotá's concessions, he ordered the rebellion's leaders to be arrested and executed. These two revolts were warning signs of an ever-growing discontented mixed-race population, and they were followed by immediate legal responses. In 1795, tensions flared between the Creole City Council of Caracas in the Viceroyalty of New Granada and the King of Spain, Carlos IV. The Crown had passed a new ordinance that allowed people of mixed Spanish and African ancestry to purchase, at some expense, a royal identification card called a cédula real. This card classified the holder as legally white, giving mixed-race people citizenship and the legal status of Creoles, and allowing them greater participation in public life and increased social mobility, such as pursuing political office or formal education. Both groups of elites, the Spanish-born peninsulars and the American-born Spanish Creoles, reacted negatively to the possibility of upward social mobility for those of mixed race. White people saw themselves as educated, productive members of society devoted to mining, ranching, and plantation activities. They regarded mixed-race people as inferior and ignorant, lost in idleness, unable to prosper, and dishonorable in every way. The City Council of Caracas argued that granting upward mobility to mixed-race people would lead to the destruction of society as they knew it. Peninsulars and Creoles worried that mixed-race people were going to take what were then perceived as the good jobs away from the upper classes. Many were so wary of mixed-race groups that they avoided working in jobs or occupations associated with them. They also feared the growing military influence and power of mixed-race people after the insurrections in the 1780s, which had paved the way for the current situation. The rebellion by enslaved people in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, that had begun in 1790, also served as a warning to white Spanish Americans of what might happen if people of African ancestry were not tightly controlled. Elites in Caracas contended that the cédula real would make it even more difficult to maintain this control and could very well lead to more insurrections. They believed that keeping the castas subordinated was the key to colonial security and safety. This is the social context in which people were immersed at the beginning of the independence movement in Latin America. Link to learning. Read the article The Pardo Question. Political Struggles on Free-Colored's Right to Citizenship During the Revolution of Caracas, 1797-1813, by Alejandro E. Gomez. Consider the reaction of the colonial elite to the upward social mobility of mixed-race people. The Napoleonic Era. The U.S. Declaration of Independence of 1776 and France's 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen stressed that all men were created equal. However, both these documents were intended to apply primarily to white males of European descent, and in both Europe and the United States, women and the enslaved were generally excluded from consideration. The rights that all men were said to possess were those of interest to free white men: property rights, freedom of expression, and the right to participate in government. Only the most radical of people in the United States and France interpreted these documents to mean that women should have the same rights as men, or that people of different races should be considered the equal of white people in terms of rights and social status. Nevertheless, these documents partially inspired a slave revolt in Saint-Domingue that proved to be one of the French Revolution's most significant effects in the Americas. The French colony of Saint-Domingue, located on the western side of the Caribbean island of Hispaniola, was founded in the mid-1600s and was soon the most profitable colony in the Americas, mostly due to the labor of enslaved Africans who were brought to the island to work on sugar, coffee, and indigo plantations. In 1791, freed and enslaved Africans and other islanders of African descent rebelled under the leadership of Toussaint Louverture and Jean-Jacques Dessalines, both of whom had been born enslaved on local plantations. This revolt evolved into a full-fledged revolution that led to the colony's independence and the declaration of the Free Republic of Haiti in 1804. The Haitian Revolution is therefore unique in that it was carried out not by white colonists of European descent seeking political representation and greater economic freedom, as had been the case in the British colonies of North America. Instead, the struggle for independence in Saint-Domingue was fought by those at the lowest levels of the social hierarchy. The rebellion in Haiti had two goals and sought two forms of liberation. For free blacks and mixed-race elites, freedom meant an end to colonialism and independence from French rule. For enslaved blacks, liberation was much more fundamental. It meant freedom from the abuse they experienced on the plantation and an end to slavery. By January 1804, through successful guerrilla tactics, black revolutionaries had decimated the French army, already suffering an outbreak of yellow fever, to create the Haitian nation. Haiti became the second liberated territory and republican system in the Western Hemisphere. After the uprising in Haiti, political elites in the Americas feared its success would inspire other slave rebellions. The idea that American Indians, free and enslaved Africans, and people of mixed racial ancestry might launch their own violent bids for independence made the Creole aristocracy hesitant to imitate the liberty-seeking Anglo-American colonists and dampened, rather than arouse, their support for independence from their parent countries. Instead, it was upheavals on the Iberian Peninsula itself that would lead to the breaking of ties between Spain and Portugal and their respective colonies. During the Napoleonic era, 1803–1814, Portugal and Spain supported different sides in the war between France and the other European nations that had united in opposition to Napoleon Bonaparte, Emperor of the French. Whereas Portugal kept its long-standing ties to Great Britain, an enemy of Napoleon, Spain was a French ally. Since the War of Spanish Succession, 1701–1714, the House of Bourbon had ruled in Spain, and its king at the time, Carlos IV, developed a disastrous policy of war with England. British naval blockades not only interrupted trade between Spain and its colonies, but in 1806, British soldiers struck Buenos Aires, in the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, present-day Argentina. Although local forces defeated the British, the attack made clear to the Spanish-American colonists the vulnerability of their own metropolis and the inability of Spain to protect them. In 1807, Napoleon implemented his continental system, or continental blockade, that required that all European ports be closed to English shipping. Portugal, however, continued to trade with Britain, one of its oldest allies. Britain could not be defeated so long as it had access to European trade through Portugal. To force Portugal into compliance, though, France would need to invade it, and it could accomplish this only by marching through Spain. By this time, Spain had become a vulnerable French satellite, and Napoleon easily obtained the Spanish crown's permission to invade Portugal by land. In so doing, Spanish subjects endured the heavy burden of taxation, war, and occupation. Confronted with rising popular resentment of the pro-French policies, Carlos IV felt pressured to abdicate in favor of his son Fernando. Napoleon quickly intervened in the succession process, detained the two men, forced both to surrender their claims to the Spanish throne, and installed his brother Joseph Bonaparte as King of Spain. But Napoleon's plan did not fully succeed. In early 1808, rather than accepting Joseph Bonaparte, most people in Spain, as well as Creole royalists and some Republicans in the colonies, rebelled. The rebellion began in Madrid but quickly spread to other cities across the Iberian Peninsula. Eventually, the Peninsular War, 1808–1814, would involve British, Spanish, and Portuguese forces, all fighting against the French. Beyond the Book, the 3rd of May 1808, commissioned by the Spanish Provisional Government after the final expulsion of the French from Spain in 1814. Spanish artist Francisco de Goya's painting the 3rd of May 1808–1814 dramatically portrays a key event in the Peninsular War. French reprisals against Spanish rebels involved in the 2nd of May uprising, figure 8. 8. The uprising, a response to the planned removal of the remaining members of the Spanish royal family to Bayonne, France, had taken place in the center of Madrid. The execution by Napoleonic soldiers depicted in the work represents one of many that took place across the city in the early hours of the morning following the uprising. Several soldiers point guns at civilians. A pile of dead civilians lies at their feet. There is blood on the ground. Figure 8. 8 the 3rd of May 1808. Francisco de Goya's painting, the 3rd of May 1808–1814, depicts the French response to the 2nd of May uprising in Madrid, Spain. Credit, the 3rd of May by the Prado Museum/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Explain how the Continental Blockade relates to Goya's painting and its celebration of Spanish resistance to Napoleon. Compare Goya's depiction of the rebels versus that of the soldiers. How do the arrangement and posture of the two groups differ? How does the artist use light and shadow to contrast the two? How is this painting revolutionary in both subject and style? What do the subject and the style tell us about the artist's intentions? The Peninsular War and the American Question. When Napoleon occupied Spain in 1807 and made its ruling royalty captive, he inadvertently sparked a crisis in Spain's American empire. As insurgents in Spain established regional governing and deliberative councils called juntas to deal with the crisis, so too did Creole elites. In key economic and political centers such as Mexico City, Caracas, Buenos Aires, Santiago, and Bogotá, the Spanish authorities surrendered control to these local juntas. For the first time in Spanish America, local government bodies enjoyed self-rule, and each of the juntas considered how it might turn this dramatic turn of events to its own advantage. That is, the solution to the political crisis in Spain breathed new life into a desire for independence throughout the main four colonial divisions. The idea of self-rule animated both those who were waiting for the Spanish king to return, the royalists, and those who craved total independence, the patriots. The royalists justified their actions by following the example of the Spanish regional juntas, but for the patriots, the formation of juntas turned the idea of complete independence into a viable goal. They organized popular demonstrations and called the loyalty of royal officials into question. From this point on, the conflict between patriots and royalists grew quickly. In Spain, the Central Revolutionary Junta yielded its power to a national parliament, the Cortes, which met in the city of Cadiz. In 1812, the Cadiz Cortes approved a liberal charter known as the Cadiz Constitution or the Constitution of 1812, which provided for limited monarchy, promised freedom of speech and assembly, and abolished the Inquisition, Figure 8. 9. The writing of the document also provoked heated debates about Spanish-American autonomy. It gave the franchise to American Indian and Mestizo men, but excluded men of African ancestry from the political process. In terms of political rights, the document legally grouped all Spanish Americans of African ancestry with felons, debtors, and domestic servants, as people denied the right to govern themselves. Such categorization reinforced the link between African ancestry and slavery. A tall tower, inscribed with 1812, stands at the center of the monument. Several stone statues of people on foot and on horseback appear nearby. Figure 8. 9. Monument to the Constitution of 1812. This monument in Cadiz, Spain, was commissioned in 1912 to commemorate the Cortes and the centennial of the Constitution of 1812. Credit: Cortes von Cadiz Monument by Hajathu/Wikimedia Commons, CC by 30. Though Creole delegates joined in the constituent deliberations, the Spanish delegates to the Cortes ensured that they retained control of the body. Denying automatic Spanish citizenship and voting rights to men born in the Americas, and refusing to count them for purposes of determining the number of delegates to the Cortes, guaranteed that power remained in the hands of the European Spaniards and not the Spanish-American colonists. Furthermore, the European Spaniards who dominated the Cortes refused to grant colonial demands to abolish the Spanish sales tax and eliminate monopolies, because the income earned from these measures was needed to fight the French. White European Spaniards thus retained their political and commercial control over the colonies. However, the experience of forming juntas and sending delegates to the Cortes had broken the colonists' obedience to Spain, and the refusal to accede to colonial demands could not be enforced. By then, the colonists had already realized that they were completely able to govern themselves. Spain's politico-economic grip on its colonies continued to weaken as its militarized response proved ineffective. With the fall of Napoleon in 1814, Fernando VII was finally restored to the Spanish throne. Rather than negotiating once he returned to power, however, he made it clear that the 6-year interlude of self-rule in the Americas was over. Fernando dissolved the Cortes, rejected the Constitution of 1812, persecuted liberals, and dispatched Spanish troops to the colonies to enforce his absolutist policies. This return to colonial order was a relief to royalists, but it enraged the patriots. The Creole juntas in Spanish America simply could not accept the high costs of returning to the previous colonial administration. Now more than ever, they wanted an equal voice in government and consent to the free trade policy already in place. The disruption of Spanish sovereignty had brought all colonial grievances to the forefront and sparked immediate reactions in the colonies. The Creole elites, resentment over the reinstatement of pre-Napoleonic policy, allowed the search for independence to spark. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to identify events and factors leading to the Mexican War of Independence. Describe Agustin de Iturbide's Plan de Iguala and the achievement of Mexican independence. The struggle for liberty in Spanish America started in North America and rippled throughout the administrative divisions of the Spanish Empire. It began in Mexico with demonstrations of discontent with the colonial regime. This first wave was socially revolutionary in nature and mobilized the indigenous and mestizo masses by emphasizing land reform and the abolition of tributary labor. Later, this movement evolved into a provisional Creole government and a plan for Mexico's first constitutional monarchy, the Mexican War of Independence. Napoleon's assault on the Bourbons in the Napoleonic Wars immediately transformed European politics, but it had a delayed effect on the Spanish colonies. Spanish-American colonial elites took their time weighing the risks, and the majority of their junta members, both in Spain and in the Americas, first swore their loyalty to the absent Spanish king. In 1808, initial meetings with the Viceroy of New Spain led to the establishment of an autonomous conservative junta in Mexico City, formed by Creoles and Peninsulars, who favored maintaining their loyalty to Spain at all costs. Representatives of New Spain, by far the richest Spanish colony, seemed to adapt to the junta system. However, in 1810, when Peninsular judges deposed the viceroy and installed their own leader in the position, Creole royalists were inspired to take full control of the government. Between 1808 and 1810, a cycle of bad harvests and famine in Mexico had harmed indigenous peasants and Creole farmers. An economic recession that occurred at the same time led to high unemployment among mestizo silver miners. The effects of these downturns were worsened by the Act of Consolidation, passed by the Spanish government in 1804, demanding that the Catholic Church deposit its wealth with the government. Because the Catholic Church had loaned money to people who bought land or started businesses, in order to comply, it now had to ask that the loans be repaid in full. This hurt many Creole merchants and landowners. Perhaps not surprisingly, then, the first insurrection for independence in New Spain took the form of a violent multi-ethnic uprising, coming from the bottom layers of the social hierarchy, and led by parish priests in mostly mestizo regions. Creole shopkeepers, professionals, minor political officials, and priests blamed the viceroyalty's government for their problems. Concerned with recent political changes and the plight of the poor and exploited, a well-educated Creole priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla took the initiative to start a movement for independence, figure 8. 10. Although Hidalgo intended to deliver a blow to the status quo and called for radical action, he proclaimed the most conservative of motives. The revolution was to be fought in the name of Fernando VII and the Virgin of Guadalupe, the ultimate symbol of Mexican Catholic piety. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla points at a document that is on his desk. A painting of the Virgin of Guadalupe appears above his desk. Figure 8. 10. Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla. This ca. 1880 portrait of the revolutionary priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla is by an unknown artist. An image of the Virgin of Guadalupe hangs on the wall behind him. Credit: Don Miguel Hidalgo by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. When conservative political authorities in Mexico City learned of his plans, Hidalgo issued a declaration in the town of Dolores on September 16, 1810. In this Grito de Dolores, grito means cry, he called upon peasants and unemployed miners to overthrow the viceroyalty's government. He demanded the abolition of slavery and tribute, the redistribution of wealth, and the return of land to the indigenous people. Another key demand was respect for the Virgin of Guadalupe, who would later become the patron saint of Mexico. The Grito de Dolores proclaimed independence as its goal, but it was unclear about the means. Hidalgo's plan envisioned a more tolerable form of government that provided benefits for the poor by seeking an end to abuses by the elite, but it lacked a program and effective leadership. The tale of the Virgin of Guadalupe, figure 811, is an expressive example of a symbol of Christian devotion, the Virgin Mary, transformed and adapted into a Mexican national emblem. According to the story of the Virgin, in 1531 she appeared to the Aztec peasant Juan Diego and spoke to him in his native language. Many Spanish clergy refused to believe Diego's claims, and the Virgin of Guadalupe's early worshippers seem to have been largely indigenous people. Hidalgo proclaimed the Virgin to be the rebellion's guardian and protector. Her image encouraged lower-class casta peasants to join the movement and fight under her banner. She was also later appropriated by Creole nationalists as a uniquely Mexican saint in order to advance their 19th-century struggle for autonomy. This is an image of the Virgin of Guadalupe. She wears a long dress and blue cloak decorated with gold stars and trim. Her hands are clasped in prayer. A small child appears below her feet. Figure 8. 11 Virgin of Guadalupe. According to legend, the Virgin of Guadalupe, who became the patron saint of Mexico, appeared to an indigenous peasant named Juan Diego in 1531 and left this image of herself on his cloak as proof. Credit: Virgin of Guadalupe by unknown/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Word of Hidalgo's rebellion quickly spread among the desperate and dispossessed castas in the region, who could now vent their grievances against the colonial administration. Within a few days, the priest had enlisted thousands of recruits in his army, which at its height totaled around 60,000 people, 55% indigenous people, and 20% of mixed race. Hidalgo's forces thus totaled more than one-third of the population of the capital of New Spain. Mexico City, the largest city on the North American continent in 1811, had a total population of almost 170,000 people. Hidalgo's followers sacked several towns and committed other destructive actions, including carrying out a mob attack that killed the city elite of Guanajuato, who had barricaded themselves in the public granary for safety. In the face of this violent turn of events, Creole and Spanish elites, even those who had originally supported Hidalgo, set aside their differences to protect their privileged positions and their lives. In doing so, they resembled the Creoles and Peninsulars of Peru who had banded together to confront Tupac Amaru's rebellion in the 1780s. In March 1811, Royalist forces captured and executed Hidalgo. Yet his army marched on, and today he is remembered as the father of independence and one of Mexico's greatest national heroes. September 16, the day of the Grito de Dolores, is Mexico's Independence Day. In 1812, another rural priest, José María Morelos y Pavón, from a poor mestizo family in southern Mexico, took charge of the independence movement, figure 812. His army was organized, and he galvanized an insurrection of artisans and peasants. Closer to indigenous people than even Hidalgo was, Morelos outlined clear sociopolitical objectives: an end to slavery and the casta system, abolition of indigenous tribute, and institution of land reform. In 1813, at the apex of his military career, Morelos convened a wartime congress in the town of Chilpancingo that declared Mexico's independence from Spain. The Congress was also charged with producing a constitution, and to guide its efforts, Morelos composed Sentiments of the Nation, a document outlining plans for social reforms, as well as the introduction of an income tax. In the painting, Pavón wears dark clothing, decorated with red accents and gold embroidery. A cross on a necklace hangs around Pavón's neck. Pavón wears a sword on his hip and holds a walking cane. Figure 8. 12 José María Morelos y Pavón. This portrait was painted in 1812 by an unknown Mixtec Indian artist. The painting's caption identifies Morelos as captain of the armies of America. Credit: Retrato del Excelentísimo Señor Don José María Morelos, by Museo Nacional de Historia/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Although the Congress produced a constitution for the nation its members officially named Mexico, Morelos's efforts were ultimately unsuccessful. He brought some order to a committed but largely undisciplined insurrection force, but he was not able to broaden his support base. He failed to persuade moderate Creoles to join the cause, and mestizos continued to make up the majority of his supporters. In December 1815, Royalist forces caught and executed him, bringing the first phase of the war for Mexican independence to an end. It was the Viceroyalty's government, not the Spanish crown, that fought both Hidalgo's and Morelos's rebellions in New Spain. That is, the Royalist armies that met the revolutionary forces were 95% Mexican, mostly Creole and mixed race. The rebellions thus represented struggles in which the people's loyalties were divided, and the final outcome was not inevitable. Mexico was experiencing a revolutionary civil war. After Morelos's death, His follower, the caste of Vicente Ramon Guerrero Saldaña, whose father supported the Spanish crown and whose uncle served in the Spanish militia, continued guerrilla operations against Spanish authorities for several more years. Figure 8. 13. While the Patriots had not yet succeeded in getting enough people on their side, Spain's hold on its colony was weakened even more. By 1820, the Viceroyalty of New Spain was relatively calm. Rebellion was about to break out again, however, as a result of events in Spain. In the painting, Saldanha wears an ornate military uniform consisting of white pants, a blue sash, and a dark jacket decorated with red accents and gold trim. His right hand rests on a cannon. A flag is visible in the background. Figure 8. 13. Vicente Ramon Guerrero Saldaña. This portrait was painted in 1850, 19 years after Guerrero's death, by the artist Anacleto Escutia. Guerrero served as the second president of Mexico from April 1 to December 17, 1829. Credit: Vicente Ramon Guerrero Saldaña, by Museo Nacional de Historia / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In their own words, Sentiments of the Nation. In 1813, José María Morelos y Pavón composed Sentiments of the Nation to guide the Congress he had charged with writing a constitution for the new nation of Mexico. In this treatise, Morelos listed 23 points he believed would create a strong nation capable of protecting and meeting the needs of all its citizens. Some of these were familiar from revolutions in the United States and France. Many, though, specifically reflected the concerns of people living in Spanish America, such as protecting the Catholic Church. Here are some of Moreles's points. 1. America is free and independent of Spain and all other nations, governments, or monarchies. 2. The Catholic faith is the sole religion, and no others will be tolerated. 4. Dogma is established by church hierarchy, the Pope, bishops, and priests. 5. Sovereignty emanates from the people and is placed in a supreme national American Congress, made up of representatives from the provinces in equal numbers. 6. Power is divided among appropriate executive, legislative, and judicial branches. 11. Liberal government is to replace tyranny with the expulsion of the Spaniards. 12. Laws should promote patriotism and industry, moderate opulence and idleness, and improve the lot and the education of the poor. 13. Laws should apply to all with no privileges. 15. Slavery is prohibited forever, as are the distinctions of caste, with all being equal and only vice and virtue distinguishing one American from the other. 1912 December is to be dedicated to the Virgin of Guadalupe and celebrated. 22. The payment of tributes is ended. A tax of 5% or similar light amount will be levied. Don José María Morelos, Sentiments of the Nation. Which of the points listed here would appeal most to American Indians and mestizos? Which seem designed to address the concerns of Creoles? Which points protect the Roman Catholic Church? Why would Morelos include these directives? Iturbide and the Plan de Iguala. In 1820, Spanish liberals succeeded in forcing Fernando VII to reinstate the liberal Cádiz Constitution of 1812. In New Spain, liberal Creoles welcomed the implementation of this constitution because it reopened possibilities for their participation in government. However, the conservative Creole elite could not accept the measures attacking the privileges of the Catholic Church and the military, in which many of them held positions. The Spanish king again proved his inefficiency in controlling the Spanish colonies, laying the ground for a second independence movement. This one was led by Creoles with the goal of improving their status and power. Rather than making colonial society egalitarian, which had been the goal of Hidalgo and Morelos, the Creole elite simply wanted to rule Mexico for themselves. The Creole elite, major landowners, military officers, and church officials, decided to declare independence from Spain and forged a very pragmatic partnership with the mestizo and indigenous followers of Vicente Guerrero. The winning strategy was to be nationalism in the form of an intense pride in Mexican, as opposed to Spanish, identity, an identity defined by birthplace that Creoles shared with indigenous and mixed-blood people, as well as the children of enslaved Africans. This mostly anti-Spanish nationalism allowed Creoles to fight for independence but keep the social hierarchy more or less intact. Agustin de Iturbide, a royalist Creole officer who had distinguished himself in the campaigns against Hidalgo and Morelos, offered such a strategy. He formed an agreement with Guerrero, the man whose revolutionary movement it had been his duty to crush. Iturbide had the military force needed to win independence, while Guerrero had the support of indigenous and mixed-race Mexicans, the majority of the population. Both shared the goal of independence from Spain. On February 24, 1821, Iturbide announced the Plan de Iguala. This plan combined both conservative and radical views and was based on principles known as the Three Guarantees: independence, religion, and equality. Mexico was to be independent of Spain. Roman Catholicism was the official religion. Social equality and protection were to be provided for all residents of Mexico, whether born in the Americas or in Spain. The plan also called for a new imperial Mexican crown, to be offered to a willing European royal, and the establishment of a regency during the waiting period before the new royal leader was named. To uphold the movement's grounding principles, a new army of the Three Guarantees, Ejército de las Tres Garantías, was formed under Iturbide's command. Link to learning. You can view the full text of the Plan de Iguala at the Library of Congress. On September 27, 1821, a date marking the 300th anniversary of the fall of the Aztec Empire and the end of an 11-year rebellious period, Iturbide made a triumphant entrance into Mexico City, Figure 8. 14. With the support of the conservative Creole elite and two powerful liberal insurgent leaders, Vicente Guerrero and Guadalupe Victoria, he proclaimed Mexican independence. Mexico became a constitutional monarchy, which, according to the Plan de Iguala, protected the interests of both Spanish-born peninsulars and the Church. At the town of Cordoba, Iturbide and the Spanish representative Viceroy Juan de O'Donoghue y Orion signed a treaty accepting the terms of the Plan de Iguala, with one adjustment. According to a new clause, in the absence of a European monarch, a local emperor could be chosen. Under this arrangement, 8 months later in 1822, the newly elected Congress confirmed Iturbide as Agustin I, constitutional emperor of Mexico. In this painting, Agustin de Iturbide rides a horse down a city street. He is followed by soldiers on horseback. Civilians line the road and crowd the second story of nearby buildings. Figure 8. 14. Agustin de Iturbide. In 1821, Agustin de Iturbide entered Mexico City as the victorious leader of the Army of the Three Guarantees. This unknown artist's imagining of the event shows him being greeted by a largely Creole crowd. Credit: Agustin de Iturbide entrance to Mexico City on 27 September 1821 by Instituto Nacional de Estudios Históricos de las Revoluciones de Mexico / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. However, Iturbide's reign was brief. His monarchy did not have popular support, and the royal requirements clashed with the fiscal realities of the new nation. In 1822, Iturbide dissolved the Congress, a move that sparked uprisings on many fronts. In 1823, he abdicated in response to growing opposition and left for exile in England. Mexico became a republic, and a new constitution was drafted. The Constitution of 1824 marked a compromise between liberal and conservative interests, with liberals favoring social reforms such as those championed by Hidalgo and Morelos, and conservatives concerned with protecting the status of elites and the church. Social equality was written into the Constitution, with the exception of special judicial privileges given to the military and the clergy. The power to pass laws and to tax was given to the government of the Mexican states. Following the adoption of the new constitution, the liberal General Guadalupe Victoria became Mexico's first president. When Iturbide changed his mind and decided to return from exile, he was captured as soon as he arrived at the port and was shot by the new Republican troops. The sharp division between liberals and conservatives dominated Mexican political life for the rest of the 19th century. Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the role of Simón Bolívar in the South American revolutions, discuss the role of José de San Martin in the South American revolutions, describe the consequences of South American liberation. From revolutionary Mexico in the Northern Hemisphere, rebellion rippled south. Spanish-American nationalists in Mexico had gained momentum for their cause when they united against the peninsulars. The southern parts of the Spanish-American Empire underwent a similar experience because the Patriot Creole group also coveted the potential benefits of independence: free trade, control over tax revenue, and local governance. There were two initial focuses, one in northern South America led by Simón Bolívar from Caracas, and another in the far south of the continent led by José de San Martin from Buenos Aires. Under the leadership of Bolívar and San Martin, the Libertadores liberators, military operations began that aimed at controlling the royalist stronghold in Peru to achieve and spread independence throughout South America. Figure 8. 15. This is a three-part map. All three parts show North and South America with a smaller inset that shows Western Europe. The first map is labeled 1808. Most of South America and about half of North America is labeled government controlled by Fernando VII under traditional Spanish law. Part of Western Europe is labeled region loyal to Supreme Central Junta or Cortes. The second map is labeled 1812. The half of North America and most of the previously labeled part of South America is now labeled region loyal to Supreme Central Junta or Cortes. The southern part of South America is labeled Junta or Insurrection Movement in the Americas. Some of Northwest South America is labeled Independent State Declared or Established. Part of Western Europe is now labeled Height of French Control of the Iberian Peninsula. The third map is labeled 1825. All of the previously highlighted territory except islands in the Atlantic Ocean is now labeled Independent State Declared or Established. 2 islands and part of Western Europe are labeled government controlled by Fernando VII under traditional Spanish law. Figure 8. 15. Transition to independence. Between 1808 and 1825, the countries of what are now Central and South America transformed from colonies governed by the King of Spain to countries governed by juntas and finally to independent nations. Credit. Modification of work, Spanish America's Revolutions, by Risvolusi/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. The Northern Liberation Movement. Between 1807 and 1810, in the judicial district of Caracas, Venezuela, in the Viceroyalty of New Granada, Royalists and Patriot Creoles from the upper-class elite struggled to create a self-governing body. Then, on April 19, 1810, the Creoles of Caracas deposed the Spanish administrative officers and created a junta to govern in the name of Fernando VII. The junta, whose authority was recognized by other cities in the Viceroyalty of New Granada, then called for the creation of a Congress, which met for the first time in March 1811. Not all in the Congress favored governing in the name of the still imprisoned King of Spain. On July 5, 1811, Patriot members who believed the body should instead govern on behalf of the people of New Granada officially declared the independence of Venezuela, making it the first South American republic. Royalists struck back. They received support among Venezuela's large African and Pardo population, whose interests had been advanced when the Spanish government gave them the opportunity to purchase white status with the cédula real. White Creoles, like the patriots in the Venezuelan Congress, had opposed greater rights for people who were not of European ancestry. Cities in the western part of New Granada had not recognized the authority of the Caracas junta or sent representatives to the Venezuelan Congress, and they also proclaimed their loyalty to the king. The Royalists received unexpected additional support for their cause when, on the Thursday before Easter in 1812, a massive earthquake hit Caracas, killing thousands. The Catholic clergy, who supported the Royalist cause, convinced the lower social classes that God had punished Caracas because of its disregard for the king's authority, which had been granted by God. The Royalist members of the government reinstituted the district's previous political links to Spain, and a bitter civil war between Royalists and Patriots ensued. Simón José Antonio de la Santísima Trinidad Bolívar y Palacios, part of the Creole elite, and impassioned about the new ideas of the Enlightenment and the French Revolution, entered the fight in 1811 as an appointed colonel of the rebel Patriot Army. After his first defeat, he took refuge on the island of Curaçao and then fled to the city of Cartagena in modern-day Colombia. From this new base, he was able to launch a successful campaign to invade Caracas in 1813 and re-establish the Republic. Figure 8. 16. In this painting, Simón Bolívar wears a military uniform and rides a white horse. Mountains and clouds are visible in the background. Figure 8. 16. Simón Bolívar. The Venezuelan libertador Simón Bolívar in Arturo Michelina's 1898 painting, made almost 70 years after Bolívar's death. Credit: Retrato Ecuster de Bolívar by Galeria de Art National/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Bolívar's success in battle was based on his commitment to fighting to the last soldier, in what became known as War to the Death, Guerra a Muerte. This strategy aimed at radicalizing the conflict and reducing support for the Royalist cause. For example, all Spaniards who did not actively support the movement for independence were sentenced to death. Bolívar's dramatic military plan left entire provinces depopulated and kept his army almost constantly in battle. His success was short-lived, however. In 1814, defeated in Venezuela, Bolívar returned to Cartagena. In 1815, after Napoleon Bonaparte's fall, the newly restored Spanish King Fernando VII sent military forces to South America to shore up his absolute authority. These Spanish forces were able to restore colonial power and defeat Bolívar and his patriot troops. Once again ousted, Bolívar sought shelter in the British colony of Jamaica, where he penned his letter from Jamaica to a newspaper. In this candid document, he outlined his vision of a unified Spanish America and reiterated his defense of independence and conviction that it would triumph. The most prescient part of the document was Bolívar's extended analysis of the past, present, and future of Spanish America. The letter reveals his Creole bias in its argument that the lower social classes were not equal to the task of gaining independence. Bolívar stressed that the mixed-race people of the Americas were condemned to civic ignorance, oppression, and vice, because the Spanish colonial system had acted as a tyrannical father and deprived them of liberty, equality, property, and security. They were forced onto the lowest social rungs, where they were unable to participate in the socio-political and economic affairs of their country. Bolívar's emphasis on his country's lack of preparation for self-government was used to reinforce his claim that Spanish Americans in general needed firm guidance and a powerful executive in their newly independent nations. Unlike many others who simply advocated for independence from Spain, Bolívar focused on the need for a strong central government rather than the federal system adopted by Mexico in its Constitution of 1824. In which power rested primarily with local authorities. Bolívar was also a promoter of Spanish-American unity, and he expressed hope for a League of American Nations, whose representatives would regularly meet and assist each other. Link to learning. Read Simón Bolívar's Letter from Jamaica from 1815, in which he analyzes his Spanish-American heritage. As you read, pay attention to his discussion of the types of government he believes will work best in Spanish America and which will not. From Jamaica, Bolívar went to Haiti, where he received asylum and economic assistance from President Alexander Paton. Though there was a clear bond of sympathy between them, their relationship had its problems. Paton's regime was genuinely liberal, but there were schisms within its ranks, and the international situation was shaky. Neither France nor the United States had yet recognized Haiti as a nation. Paton's assistance was therefore discreet. Bolívar received hard cash, armaments, and a recruited black military force under one condition: put an end to slavery in the newly independent nations. With the help of those forces, Bolívar sailed back to the Orinoco River Delta in Venezuela and turned the tide in favor of the Patriot Army. He was able to do so, however, only after gaining the support of the mixed-race cowboys, the Llaneros, who dominated much of the region, and of their chieftain José Antonio Paz. Thousands of Llaneros joined Bolívar's army at this critical juncture. A key reason for his success was likely his ability to enlist both the marginalized mixed-race and black populations and the Creole elites in his cause. It was only after he allowed the common people to join his army that he was able to consistently win the wars of independence, whose decisive victory came at Boyacá, Colombia, in August 1819. After liberating Venezuela, Bolívar took the rest of New Granada. Bogotá fell only after he had led an army of 2,500 men up to the Orinoco River, climbed over the Andes Mountains, crossed flooded rivers and plains in the midst of the rainy season, with Bolívar carrying soldiers who had become too weak to stand, and descended on the enemy. In 1819, Bolívar established the Congress of Angostura, in modern-day Ciudad Bolívar in Venezuela, which approved the creation of the nation of Colombia, encompassing modern Venezuela, Colombia, and Ecuador. The Congress vested Bolívar with dictatorial powers. He rejected monarchy, with its potential to lead to dictatorship, but he also warned against federalism and popular democracy, for which he felt Spanish Americans were unprepared. He advocated a republican form of government anchored in a powerful hereditary Senate. The Senate, formed by educated and suitable individuals, was to be a sound intermediary between the people and the government. In his Angostura address, Bolívar outlined his ideas about how to balance freedom and order as well as how to navigate sensitive race relations. Military brilliance does not necessarily signal political skill, however, and neither Bolívar's fledgling dream of a representative republican system nor his ideal of Pan-American unity were shared by others in the region. With time, it became clear those ideas were not to succeed. In an 1821 gathering in the city of Cúcuta, in present-day Colombia, patriot representatives from Venezuela and New Granada, also present-day Colombia, decided on the unification of the former territories of the Viceroyalty of New Granada, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador, and Panama, into one federative nation called Gran Colombia. Bolívar put Francisco de Paula Santander in charge of New Granada's regional administration. The Revolutionary Cúcuta Congress outlined a liberal program of reforms and adopted a centralized constitution and the gradual granting of citizenship rights to all. The most pressing issue was slavery. Enslaved and mixed-race people demanded emancipation, which had been promised in the rhetoric of national liberation, and which Bolívar had assured Paton he would accomplish. In 1820, he ordered Santander to promise emancipation and recruit an army of 5,000 willing enslaved people. Afraid of alienating the region's mine and landowners, who depended on slave labor, Santander limited the recruitment to 3,000 and instructed the rest to return to their masters. Bolivar's position, already presented in his Jamaica Letters critique of Spanish colonial control, was clearly reflected in the Constitution. Accordingly, the Republic of New Granada, the first to grant its citizens the responsibilities of self-government, limited voting rights to male property owners. Minorities, women, poor white people, and people of African descent still yearned for freedom and equality. The abolition of slavery law, enacted by the Cucuta Congress, delegated a gradual and complicated process to committees of local notables, which simply prolonged the institution of slavery. Link to learning. Read The Struggle for Abolition in Gran Colombia by Harold A. Birk, Jr. to explore cultural inequality in Gran Colombia, the Southern Liberation Movement. Like the port town of Caracas in the north, the port of Buenos Aires in the south reaped significant benefits from the 18th century reforms aimed at developing the Spanish Empire's outskirts, formerly subject to the authority of the Spanish Viceroyalty of Peru. In 1776, Buenos Aires became the seat of the newly created Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata, modern-day Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, and Uruguay. The port was the principal outlet from which silver from Bolivia and animal hides and tallow from the vast plains of Argentina and Uruguay reached markets abroad. The town's residents, known as porteños, also enjoyed abundant opportunities for trading in contraband with the British and Portuguese. The population of Buenos Aires quadrupled in the last half of the 18th century. It was almost 40,000 by 1800. And merchants and civic leaders took pride in their growing prosperity. Accordingly, rising fortunes in Rio de la Plata created a newly favorable environment for those who preferred rupture to reform. There was a ripe international market for South American products like sugar, hides, cacao, tobacco, and silver, and the Creole elite were eager to open their ports to British, Dutch, and French merchants. And with their easy access to Atlantic foreign merchants, Argentine elites in Buenos Aires also had much to gain from greater autonomy. Following Napoleon's invasion of Spain in 1808, the Creole militia officers in Argentina formed a new governing junta that proclaimed support for Fernando VII. However, after almost 2 years, radical changes within the patriot majority of the junta led them to repudiate Spanish authority, silence local opposition, and proclaim Argentina's revolutionary patriot movement on May 25, 1810. Not all regions of Rio de la Plata, however, recognized the authority of the junta, which was based in Buenos Aires. Successful military campaigns in the central part of Argentina soon brought this area under the control of the junta, but its troops were not able to secure Uruguay and Paraguay, which rejected control by Buenos Aires. In March 1816, Argentina's conservative local leaders invoked a congress in Tucumán. The Congress declared the independence of the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata on July 9, 1816, now Independence Day in Argentina, less as a sign of revolutionary militancy than as a practical recognition of their political situation. Resistance came not from faraway Spain, but from the neighboring royalist provinces, Uruguay and Paraguay, when Argentina attempted once again to extend its authority there. Paraguayans had already declared their independence from both Spain and the Argentine government in 1811. The new country quickly devolved into a dictatorship under José Gaspar Rodríguez de Francia, a lawyer who had briefly taught theology at a seminary in Paraguay. He was chosen one of Paraguay's ruling consuls by the country's Congress on October 1, 1813. In imitation of the Roman Republic, Paraguay had 2 consuls, chief executives who each also controlled one half of the country's army. In March 1814, Francia, who was an advocate for the common man, passed a law requiring racial intermarriage. White Europeans could marry only people of African, indigenous, or mestizo ancestry. A few months later, Paraguay's Congress made Francia the country's only consul and gave him absolute power for 3 years. In 1816, Congress made him dictator of Paraguay for life. Intent on realizing the ideals of the French Revolution and influenced by the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Francia, while continuing to support the Catholic Church by building new churches and funding religious festivals, attempted to improve the lives of the poor by abolishing tithes and giving the Paraguayan government control over institutions such as hospitals and orphanages that had been run by the church. He instituted measures to modernize agriculture and established national industries, focused solely on reforming society and determined to make Paraguay self-sufficient. Francia ended foreign trade, prevented river traffic between Argentina and Paraguay, and adopted a position of neutrality in foreign policy. Paraguay was thus isolated from the revolutionary turmoil that gripped the rest of South America. Just as the people of Paraguay charted their own path to independence, the inhabitants of the eastern province of Montevideo, modern-day Uruguay, resisted threats from La Plata and Brazil and built their own movement under José Gervasio Artigas. Montevideo remained in Spanish hands until 1814, when it fell to the Argentines, who ignored Artigas's demands for autonomy. Creole patriots had the upper hand all over Spanish South America. The only exception was the Viceroyalty of Peru, the most solid bulwark of Spanish power in South America, where royalist armies were stationed and most Creoles remained steadfastly royalist. Peru was a constant threat to patriots, and its liberation was vital. By 1817, the Argentine general José Francisco de San Martin y Mataroz, who had fought against Napoleon in Spain in 1812, had set up a plan to isolate and attack royalists in Peru, the Spanish stronghold. He organized an army camp at the base of the Andes, and under his command, Argentine forces scored great successes. In January 1817, after careful preparation, he led his 5,000 soldiers through the Andean mountains, where altitudes approached more than 10,000 feet above sea level, and over 6 different passes into Chile. Chile had already broken from the Viceroyalty of Peru when Creole Spanish Americans there had established their own junta in 1810. However, the region had been plagued by fighting between royalists and various pro-independence factions who supported differing degrees of autonomy. When royalists gained the upper hand, the leader of one of those factions, Bernardo O'Higgins, found himself exiled to Argentina. There he met San Martin, and together they planned an assault on Spanish royalist forces in Chile, figure 8. San Martin's assistance secured a decisive victory, and O'Higgins declared Chile's independence in 1818. 2 men wearing military uniforms are on horseback. Mountains are visible in the background. Figure 8. 17 José de San Martin and Bernardo O'Higgins. In this late 19th century painting by Julio Villa y Prades, the Argentine José de San Martin, left, and Bernardo O'Higgins of Chile are shown crossing the Andes to liberate Chile in 1817. Credit, San Martin and O'Higgins crossing the Andes, by Museo Histórico y Militar de Chile / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. In 1856, the Colombian intellectual José María Torres Caicedo used the term Latin America for the first time. Read novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez's 1982 Nobel Prize acceptance speech, The Solitude of Latin America, to learn his opinions of Western perceptions about the history of Spanish America and the narrative associated with its independence movements. The Guayaquil Conference. The northern and southern forces of the South American independence movements converged in the firmly royalist Viceroyalty of Peru and made Lima, the capital city, their target. From the north, one stream of revolutionary armies led by Bolivar flowed from the Viceroyalty of New Granada, and from the south, another led by San Martin swept up from the Viceroyalty of Rio de la Plata and the newly independent Republic of Chile. San Martin departed Chile in 1820 with both land forces and sailors on ships. He had the assistance of Scottish former naval officer and mercenary Thomas Cochrane, one of the foreigners who, on their own initiative, had joined the South American patriots in their struggle for independence. San Martin launched a naval assault on Royalist Peru in Lima and landed on its shores in September 1820. Though the highlands remained in Royalist hands, his arrival started an uprising along the coast, and he gradually expanded his foothold until he occupied Lima itself. On July 28, 1821, Peruvian Creoles in the city were forced to declare independence and accept San Martin as protector of Peru. Lima was now under San Martin's military and civil rule, but Royalist troops continued to control the vast Peruvian hinterland, and the inhabitants of the capital saw him and his forces as foreign invaders. Following his liberation of Bogotá in 1819, Bolívar and his armies had moved on to Ecuador. Making little progress against the remaining Royalists, San Martin and Bolívar, rivals for control of the independence movement, decided to meet in Guayaquil, Ecuador. In 1821, Guayaquil's valuable port and naval base had fallen under Bolívar's control, and in 1822, he had entered the city of Quito and declared Ecuador's independence. In July 1822, San Martin set sail for Guayaquil with hopes of convincing the port city's merchants to unite with Lima. However, Bolívar had arrived earlier and pressed his Guayaquil supporters for union with Colombia. When San Martin landed in the city, the possession of the city no longer figured in their discussion. Probably disillusioned, San Martin conferred with Bolívar behind closed doors. The talks were secret, but by their end, San Martin had decided to leave the completion of the liberation of South America to Bolívar. Shortly thereafter, San Martin withdrew from the independence struggle and went into a self-imposed exile in Europe, never again to return. Bolívar occupied Lima in 1823, and in February 1824, a Peruvian Congress named him dictator of Peru. He won a significant victory against Spanish forces in August 1824 at the Battle of Junin, and in December 1824, his skilled chief of staff Antonio José de Sucre defeated a much larger Spanish force at the Battle of Ayacucho. In 1825, following their defeat by Sucre, Royalist troops in Upper Peru renamed Bolivia in honor of El Libertador, accepted a general amnesty. In regard to the place of South American nations in the larger geopolitical sphere, both Bolívar and San Martin demonstrated a continent-wide outlook and support for close alliances among the newly independent nations. San Martin shared with the Mexican conservatives an admiration for the British constitutional monarchy, but Bolívar rejected the mystical figure of the king and believed the republican system was the best guarantee of stability. In 1822, Gran Colombia became the first Spanish-American nation to receive diplomatic recognition from the United States. The United States was anxious that European countries not use the Latin American wars of independence as an excuse to intervene in the Western Hemisphere. Such an action would threaten not only the young nation's security but also its commerce. In 1815, in the wake of Napoleon's defeat at Waterloo, Austria, Prussia, and Russia had formed the Holy Alliance. Its purpose was to protect European empires by discouraging revolution, such as the one that had engulfed France. At conferences in 1820 and 1821, the Holy Alliance declared their right to intervene in rebellions that threatened to unseat European monarchs. And in 1821, a rebellion in Naples was crushed by invading Austrian troops. Although the Holy Alliance had not intervened in 1820 to help Fernando VII when Spanish liberals had forced him to reinstitute the Constitution of 1812. In 1822, they agreed to support an invasion of Spain by France's Louis XVII for the purposes of bringing an end to the Spanish revolutionary movement and restoring the imprisoned Fernando to the throne. The members of the Holy Alliance intended also to assert Fernando VII's control over his rebellious American colonies. The United States opposed such intervention as did Britain, which carried on extensive trade with Latin America. Britain's foreign minister proposed that the United States join Britain in issuing a joint statement warning France and the Holy Alliance against imposing their will on the former Spanish colonies. U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, however, considered it more candid as well as more dignified for the new country to avow our principles explicitly than to allow the British to take the lead. Accordingly, with the reluctant agreement of President James Monroe, in 1823, Adams set forth the Monroe Doctrine, a principle of U.S. foreign policy that warned European nations to refrain from interfering with independent countries in the Western Hemisphere. Although gratified by U.S. support, Bolivar trusted more in British influence to block Spain's attempts to regain its American colonies, and did not give much importance to the Monroe Doctrine. In 1824, Great Britain joined the United States in officially recognizing Gran Colombia, whose representatives obtained a significant loan from the London financial market. In 1826, Bolivar convened the Congress of Panama to strengthen fraternal ties among the newly independent nations in former Spanish America, adopt programs of mutual cooperation, and create a permanent alliance. Conspicuously absent were the United States, Haiti, and Brazil. However, the main difficulty was the internal fragility of the new nations. The legacy of the Spanish-American revolutions was contradictory. Although the new nations had broken free of Spain, colonial social hierarchies persisted. These then escalated into a social struggle among the enslaved Africans, indigenous groups, mestizos, pardos, and white people. Provinces fought each other, and after defeating royalist forces, the popular armies faced civil wars over a new post-colonial order. Creole leaders like Bolivar and San Martin were not the only heirs of independence. The main post-colonial leaders were the local military chieftains, who often forged alliances with wealthy Creole landowners and perpetuated their power. Dueling voices. Justification for revolution. Simón Bolívar and other Spanish-American patriots believed they were justified in proclaiming independence from Spain. In his Letter from Jamaica, Bolívar deplored Spain's mistreatment of its American colonies and the brutality of its attempts to defeat their fight for liberty. The Spanish government, however, believed the people in its American colonies had received the benefits of its protection and were now behaving ungratefully. In a letter to U.S. Secretary of State John Quincy Adams, a Spanish official named Don Joaquin de Anduaga protested U.S. recognition of the revolutionary governments, reiterated Spain's lack of responsibility for the rebels' anger, and took pains to differentiate Bolivar's revolution from the U.S. War of Independence. Compare Bolivar's position immediately following with that of Anduaga, which follows Bolivar's. The hatred that the peninsula has inspired in us is greater than the ocean between us. It would be easier to have the two continents meet than to reconcile the spirits of the two countries. The habit of obedience, a community of interest, of understanding, of religion, mutual goodwill, a tender regard for the birthplace and good name of our forefathers. In short, all that gave rise to our hopes came to us from Spain. As a result, there was born principle of affinity that seemed eternal, notwithstanding the misbehavior of our rulers, which weakened that sympathy, or rather, that bond enforced by the domination of their rule. At present the contrary attitude persists. We are threatened with the fear of death, dishonor, and every harm. There is nothing we have not suffered at the hands of that unnatural stepmother Spain. The veil has been torn asunder. We have already seen the light, and it is not our desire to be thrust back into darkness. The chains have been broken, we have been freed, and now our enemies seek to enslave us anew. For this reason America fights desperately, and seldom has desperation failed to achieve victory. We have been harassed by a conduct which has not only deprived us of our rights, but has kept us in a sort of permanent infancy with regard to public affairs. If we could at least have managed our domestic affairs and our internal administration, we could have acquainted ourselves with the processes and mechanics of public affairs. We should also have enjoyed a personal consideration, thereby commanding a certain unconscious respect from the people, which is so necessary to preserve amidst revolutions. Simón Bolívar, Letter from Jamaica, 1819. I have seen the message sent by the President to the House of Representatives, in which he proposes the recognition, by the United States, of the insurgent governments of Spanish America. How great my surprise was may be easily judged by anyone acquainted with the conduct of Spain towards the United States. And moreover, will not his astonishment be augmented to see that the U.S. is desirous to give the destructive example of sanctioning the rebellion of provinces which have received no offense from the mother country, to whom she has granted a participation in a free constitution, and to whom she extended all the rights and prerogatives of Spanish citizens. In vain will a parallel be attempted to be drawn between the emancipation of this republic, the U.S., and that which the Spanish rebels attempt, and history is sufficient to prove that if a harassed and persecuted province has a right to break its chains, others, loaded with benefits, elevated to the high rank of freedom, ought only to bless and embrace more closely the protecting country which has bestowed such favors upon them. Don Joaquin de Anduaga, Letter to John Quincy Adams, March 9, 1822. What specific grievances against Spain does Bolivar outline? How do you think Anduaga would respond to these? How would Bolivar respond to Anduaga's claim that Spanish-American colonists were given the same rights as other citizens? To what extent is Anduaga's statement true? To what extent is it false? Learning objectives. By the end of this section, you will be able to discuss the relocation of the Portuguese monarchy to Brazil, describe Brazil's path to independence, explain what differentiated the Empire of Brazil from neighboring republics. Imagine transporting the U.S. President and all the members of Congress and their families across the ocean in 40 vessels on a trip that lasted months. This is what the Portuguese royal house of Braganza did in 1807, and for more than a decade after that, Portugal ruled its empire from the Americas rather than from Europe. This unprecedented move set the tone for the independence of Portuguese America, which was pursued relatively peacefully compared to the liberation movements in Spanish America. Furthermore, whereas Spanish America fragmented into many countries, Portuguese America remained one nation, Brazil. In September 1822, Brazil became independent under a Portuguese-born king and adopted a constitutional monarchical system. The monarchy brought political stability to the region, but did not challenge colonial hierarchies. The establishment of the Kingdom of Brazil. In 1807, when Napoleon instituted his continental system aimed at isolating Britain and economically destroying it, Portugal, notable for its long-standing alliance with Britain, was not able to comply. To punish Portugal's breaking of his naval blockade, Napoleon obtained the Spanish crown's permission to invade Portugal by land, since the French navy was not capable of facing the British at sea. French troops commanded by General Jean-Andoche Junot swept across the Iberian Peninsula to storm into Lisbon. In view of these events, Lord Strangford, Great Britain's diplomatic envoy to Portugal, counseled the Portuguese royal family to move the court to Portuguese America. Queen Maria wore the Portuguese crown, but because she had been declared mentally incapacitated, her son, the Prince Regent João, was left with the decision. The imminent arrival of French forces in November 1807 finally convinced João that fleeing to Brazil was the only solution. As the troops approached, the Portuguese royal family and its entourage of about 10,000 people escaped to Brazil in a fleet under British convoy, figure 818. In return for their assistance, the British received generous commercial privileges in Brazil. A crowd of men span the painting from left to right and stand facing forward. There are a couple of children with them. A fleet of large ships is in the background. Figure 8. 18. A royal family flees. In 1807, the Portuguese House of Braganza and its court fled to Brazil to avoid being captured by French troops. The scene was imagined in this small-scale painting by an unknown 19th-century artist. Credit: Embarkation of the Portuguese Royal Family by Itamaraty Historical and Diplomatic Museum / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. In 1808, after a short stop in Salvador, Bahia, the royal family and their courtiers were welcomed by Brazilian colonists and departed to settle in Rio de Janeiro on the southeastern coast. For the first time in modern history, a European monarch, heir, and court had set foot in their American domain. On April 1, 1808, Brazilian ports were opened to all friendly nations, which really meant Great Britain. All previous manufacturing prohibitions intended to protect Portuguese industry were revoked, and the Bank of Brazil was established. As a result, Brazil's total population jumped from almost 3 million in 1798 to almost 4 million in 1818. The Portuguese crown's willingness to share power with the local planter aristocracy led to the expansion of institutions such as hospitals, libraries, and schools and universities. Vital reforms in administration, agriculture, and manufacturing were instituted. Though the cultural initiatives were welcome, the new tax burden imposed to pay for the needs of the royal court, the expanded bureaucracy, and the war against France, as well as Brazil's great dependence on Great Britain, were not. The presence of the Portuguese crown centralized control of Brazil in Rio de Janeiro to a great degree, however, and this centralization became a powerful force for the unification of Brazil as one nation. Even after the fall of Napoleon in 1814 and the restoration of Bourbon kings in both France and Spain, the Portuguese crown resolutely stayed on in Brazil. On December 16, 1815, Brazil was officially given the status of a kingdom. When Queen Maria I died there in 1816, her son became João VI, King of the United Kingdoms of Portugal, Brazil, and Algarve, the southern edge of Portugal. Brazil also opened its ports to Bonapartist immigrants, including Republican-minded scientists, architects, artisans, Freemasons, engineers, painters, and officers who crossed the Atlantic with their liberal books and ideas, intending to settle permanently in the new land. Under the sponsorship of King João VI, a group of Bonapartist artists and artisans, known as the French Artistic Mission, were invited to Brazil in March 1816 to establish an arts and crafts lyceum in Rio de Janeiro. The lyceum later became the Academia Imperial de Belas Artes under Emperor Pedro I. French painter Jean-Baptiste Debret, who had studied at France's prestigious Académie des Beaux-Arts, was part of the group. Debret developed an interest in the enslaved and indigenous peoples and produced many lithographs and paintings depicting people and everyday life in Brazil. He also painted many portraits of the imperial court, figure 819. After returning to France in 1831, Debret joined the Académie des Beaux-Arts. By the end of the decade, he had published 3 volumes of engravings, A Picturesque and Historic Voyage to Brazil, or The Sojourn of a French Artist in Brazil, Voyage pittoresque et historique au Brésil au séjour d'un artiste français au Brésil. In this painting, King João VI wears an ornate uniform decorated by medals and jewelry. His left hand rests on the hilt of a sword. He carries a scepter in his right hand. A crown sits nearby. Figure 8. 19. King João VI. This small-scale 1817 portrait of King João VI of Portugal was painted by Jean-Baptiste Debret, who immigrated to Brazil as a member of the French Artistic Mission. Credit: Portrait of John VI of Portugal by Museu Nacional de Belas Artes / Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Link to learning. Explore the work of French artist Jean-Baptiste Debret, who lived in Brazil between 1816 and 1831, during that nation's transition to independence, and whose work depicted street scenes, local costumes, and gender relations. King João VI was more sympathetic to his Brazilian subjects than King Fernando VII was to his own in Spanish America. Nevertheless, rebellions within Brazil were suppressed with force. For instance, in 1817, Brazilians from Pernambuco, a sugar-planting province on the northeastern coast, reacted to the arrest of a liberal military officer by declaring the province an autonomous republic. King João VI quickly put a brutal end to their experiment. He finally returned to Portugal in 1821, 6 years after Napoleon's fall, when the Cortes, the Portuguese parliament, demanded his return. Pedro I and Brazilian independence. João left his son and heir Pedro I as Prince Regent in Rio de Janeiro, with instructions to preserve the family's lineage and power. The talented 23-year-old prince enthusiastically took to his duties. The Cortes wanted to reduce Brazil to its former colonial status and ordered the dismantling of Rio's central government structure. In January 1822, it commanded the prince to return, but Pedro sided with the Brazilians when they asked him to stay. This event became known as O Fico, from the Portuguese ficar, to remain. The intentions of the Cortes could now no longer be ignored, however, because they generated conflicts among conservative and liberal factions in the Brazilian provinces. When the Brazilian elites rejected rule by Portugal, Pedro took the final step. He broke with Portugal and on September 7, 1822, declared Brazilian independence on the banks of the Ipiranga River in the province of São Paulo, figure 8.20. This event became known as the Grito do Ipiranga, Ipiranga Cry. Pedro I was acclaimed constitutional emperor and perpetual defender of Brazil, and he was crowned in Rio de Janeiro with much pomp and ceremony. Pedro I is in the center of the painting. He rides a horse and holds his sword in the air. A group of men behind him are also on horses and hold their hats in the air. A group of uniformed soldiers on horseback face him and raise their swords in the air. A farmer leading his cows looks at the group. Figure 8.20, the Grito do Ipiranga. Pedro Américo's massive 1888 painting shows Pedro I declaring Brazil's independence with the Grito do Ipiranga on September 7, 1822. Credit: Independence or Death by Museu Paulista Collection /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. At first, the Portuguese Cortes refused to recognize Brazil's independence, though away from the cities of Rio de Janeiro and São Paulo and their adjoining provinces, few local juntas declared themselves in favor of Portuguese rule. Determined to beat the Portuguese, Pedro I invited Thomas Cochrane, a former British naval officer, to serve Brazil as First Admiral and Commander-in-Chief, figure 821. In this engraving Thomas Cochrane, he wears an ornate military uniform. He carries a scope, figure 8.21. Thomas Cochrane, Earl of Dundonald, is shown in a 19th century engraving based on a painting by James Ramsay. Lord Cochrane played a major role in winning independence for Brazil. Credit: Thomas Cochrane, 10th Earl of Dundonald, by Dibner Library of the History of Science and Technology /Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Cochrane was one of the most daring and successful naval captains of his day. The French called him the Sea Wolf. After being struck off Britain's Navy list because of a financial scandal in 1814, he began a new career as a mercenary. In 1818, he organized the Chilean Navy, and with José de San Martin, he played a crucial role in securing Chile's independence and liberating coastal areas in Peru. He was living in semi-retirement on his estate in Chile when Pedro I asked him to serve Brazil. Cochrane organized a small Brazilian naval squadron to block Portugal's access to Brazil's ports. His first success came with his blockade of Salvador, the main port of the province of Bahia. By preventing resupply of coastal cities and garrisons, Cochrane forced Portuguese fighting forces to abandon the northern provinces of Brazil by 1823. In 1825, the Treaty of Rio de Janeiro recognized Brazil's independence from Portugal. The presence of the Braganzas in Rio for 13 years before independence had unified the nation, and Brazilians still looked to the royal court as a source of power and authority. Most educated citizens accepted the monarchy, with which they identified themselves, and nothing served better to end regional divisions than the external threat from Portugal. In May 1823, Pedro I summoned elected representatives from all provinces to come to Rio and draft the new empire's constitution. Most were Brazilian sons of the old landed aristocracy, and some had represented Brazil in the Portuguese Cortes, including the liberal José Bonifacio de Andrade e Silva, educated at Portugal's Coimbra University. The Assembly drafted a document that sought balance among the executive, judiciary, and legislative branches of government, but disagreed over slavery, the scope of citizenship, and civil rights. Although Pedro I favored the gradual abolition of slavery, Brazilians whose wealth came from sugar plantations were especially concerned that the institution not be interfered with. The past meets the present. Women and the fight for independence. Valued primarily for their sexual purity, domestic virtue, and Christian charity, women found their claims to political equality in Spanish and Portuguese America seriously limited. As a result, they responded in different ways to the struggle for independence, which pervaded every aspect of their lives. Poor women suffered disproportionately, and many made significant contributions to the cause, including taking up arms and even commanding troops. The women depicted here are just some examples of those who fought for independence and political power in the Revolutionary period. Figure 8. 22. Image A is a painting of Manuela Sainz. She wears a black dress and a necklace. Image B is a painting of Juana Azurduy de Padilla. She wears a military uniform which is decorated with medals and she holds a sword. Image C is a painting of Empress Maria Leopoldina. She wears a dress. Image D is a painting of Maria Quiteria. She wears a military uniform and carries a gun. Figure 8. 22 fighters for independence. A. Manuela Sainz. B. Juana Azurduy de Padilla. C. Empress Maria Leopoldina, and D. Maria Quiteria all played a role in the fight for independence in South America. Credit a modification of work, Retrato de Manuela Sainz in 1825 por Pedro Durante, by Museo Nacional de Arqueologia, Antropologia y Historia del Perú/Wikipedia, public domain. Credit B. Portrait of Juana Azurduy by Salón de Espejos de la Alcaldía de Padilla/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit C. Portrait of Archduchess Maria Leopoldina, later Empress Consort of Brazil by Schönbrunn Palace/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Credit D. Maria Quiteria by Museu do Ipiranga/Wikimedia Commons, public domain. Born in Quito, Ecuador, in 1797, Manuela Sainz de Vergara y Izpuru was the illegitimate child of an Ecuadorian mother and a Spanish aristocrat. In 1817, she married British citizen James Thorne, and in 1822 she met and fell in love with Simón Bolívar. As a result, she left her husband and joined the fight for independence, becoming a close collaborator of Bolívar and a fierce proponent of the revolutionary cause and women's rights. After she prevented his assassination in 1828, Bolívar called her Libertadora del Libertador, the woman who liberated the liberator. After Bolívar's death in 1830, Sainz ended her days running a tobacco shop in a fishing village on the coast of Peru, where she died of diphtheria in 1856 and was buried in a common grave. However, with the rise of feminism in the 1980s, she became a symbol and rallying point for a variety of liberation movements. especially upon publication of The General in His Labyrinth by the award-winning Colombian novelist Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Under the strict casta system of Spanish colonial rule, Juana Azurduy de Padilla, born in 1780 in what is today the city of Sucre, Bolivia, was a mestiza. As a child, she had a close relationship with her white Spanish father, who taught her to ride, shoot, and work the land alongside the indigenous people who lived there. After becoming orphaned as a teen, she went to a convent school to be educated, but she eventually returned to her family's estate and married her neighbor Manuel Padilla, an influential politician with progressive views. Azurduy and her husband became patriot guerrilla military leaders in 1809, joining the Army of the North in Upper Peru. Azurduy was known for her ability to recruit and lead indigenous people, and eventually rose to the rank of lieutenant colonel in 1816. At the time of her death, she was relatively unknown. However, today the Azurduy province in the Chuquisaca department is named for her. The life of Maria Leopoldina of Austria was one of royal patronage and political influence. She married Dom Pedro, later Emperor Pedro I, in 1817, and dedicated her energies to supporting the cultural and scientific development of her adopted nation, Brazil, bringing the Austrian painter Thomas Ender and many others there. It was after Pedro had read one of Leopoldina's letters that he enacted the Grito do Ipiranga. In her letter, she urged him to defy Portugal and break away from it, saying, "Brazil under your guidance will be a great country. Brazil wants you as a monarch. Pedro, this is the most important of your life. You have the support of all Brazil." Although Pedro I's autocratic methods of government and scandalous private affairs made her life difficult, Leopoldina was very popular among her Brazilian subjects and remained so even after her death in 1826. One of those subjects was Maria Quiteria, born in 1792 in the province of Bahia. During the Brazilian War of Independence, Quiteria disguised herself